Hello, everyone. For those who are familiar with my channel, I want to just preface this by saying this is a sort of different type of video that I'm going to be making here. This is not music related. And so if you're new here, you're going to probably like nothing has changed. But I want to film this video. I've been wanting to do it for a while. And I just decided, before this new TV show called The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power premieres in September, I wanted to get out on camera all of my preliminary thoughts and hopes and fears for the the mess that is to come. Unfortunately, outlooks are not looking so good in the Tolkien fandom for this show. And so I want to just, before it premieres, I want to just preface this by saying, this video is going to just be for, all you Tolkien fans out there, Lord of the Rings fans. I just wanted to synthesize everything that I had been seeing and just sort of give my 2 cents about the show and sort of deep dive into the making of it, because this is something that I feel very strongly about. The Lord of the Rings, the books and the movies, were a seminal part of my childhood growing up. I was introduced to them at a pretty young age in elementary school, and I'll admit the Peter Jackson films were actually really what sealed the deal for me. The books I was introduced to around the time the movies came out. So it's kind of hard for me to remember which came first for me, but I did read all of the books when I was pretty young, at like 11 and 12 years old. I had read, The Hobbit and the three Lord of the Rings books, as well as at the age of 12, I read the Silmarillion, which at that age was definitely a bit dense to read. And of course, the first time you read it, you're just like, what am I reading? So I've reread it subsequently a couple times over the years. And then I've read some more posthumously published, edited Christopher Tolkien novels, which I will showcase in my collection here. But, basically, Lord of the Rings was and still is to this day, especially, the books are my favorite fantasy fiction series ever. No fantasy novel that I have read. And granted, I have definitely read more, and especially in my more adult life. I read a lot more when I was a teenager and as a child, but they're the best fantasy that has ever been made, and the best fantasy epic, in my opinion. And the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films are my favorite films of all time. They also have my favorite soundtrack of all time. So there is a tie-in with music for my channel, because I know I talk a lot about music. And I have talked about the soundtrack on my channel before, actually. But all of this is to say that it was bittersweet knowing we were getting only 3 films, and then it was like, that's all done. Harry Potter, which was my other big love as a child, was like this ongoing thing that lasted like 10 years, but it was really longer because the books came out before the final film. It was like, in total, it was just this long, epic journey that fans who got to grow up with it got to experience. And even now, there's all these additions to it. The franchise is still alive. With the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, having them come to a close was sort of bittersweet, knowing I felt like they had just tapped into the real potential of visual storytelling for Tolkien's works. When we found out that we were getting the Hobbit films made, that was a long speculated thing, that Peter Jackson was also going to be returning to film those. A decade ago now, Lord of the Rings was 2 decades ago, and now it's been a decade since the Hobbit films, which it's crazy to think it's been that long. Obviously, I was fangirling. I mean, I was always more of a fan of The Lord of the Rings as a book and series than I was of The Hobbit. The Hobbit felt a little more rudimentary. It's just sort of like an appetite teaser. It's not really the full meal. So The Hobbit being what it was, and I'm not going to harp too long on this, but, most Tolkien fans agree that the Hobbit films were a complete mess. And I am, I will confess that I do own all 3 extended editions, because I needed that fix, especially when it came out. But the Hobbit films do not have the revisiting, nostalgic, staying power that the original trilogy had. But also, as far as awards and such, was, critically much more acclaimed. The Hobbit trilogy, which did not need to be a trilogy, was unfortunately a step in the wrong direction in terms of how to adapt Tolkien on the big screen, which brings us into talking about Rings of Power. So, Lord of the Rings has been done. I don't feel like anyone should touch the trilogy for at least another 50 years or at least a while, because 25, like the Lord of the Rings, it could be done a different way. I'm not saying it's completely out of the question for someone else to do it. Maybe they even do it better if that was possible. But I don't want to see any Lord of the Rings remakes, especially live action, anytime soon, because that's just such an insult to the amazing trilogy that we already have. That being said, when this show was announced, and now we've done The Hobbit, so we've gotten that out of our system. But what of all of the other Tolkien works? Now, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were the only books that were published while Tolkien was still alive in the Lord of the Rings mythos. All of his later works were compiled and released posthumously by his son Christopher Tolkien. The most famous of which being the Silmarillion, which was published in 1977. And this is my copy, or it's one of my copies. I actually have two copies. Oops. This is a slightly, cheaper and doesn't have actual beautiful illustrations and paintings inside. But this one has beautiful art done by this painter named Ted Naismith. And, reading this as a kid was this was my Bible, okay? This was my Bible. And if you've read it, you know that that's not just, a comparison in terms of a book I read all the time. I mean, this book literally is the Bible to Middle-earth because it starts at the very beginning with creation of the cosmos. And it goes all the way up through the events of The Lord of the Rings. So the Silmarillion, as soon as I read it, I was like, right off the heels of the Peter Jackson films, I was like, someday I need to see someone adapt this. Granted, maybe not the entire thing, because it would be like making a movie of the Bible, okay? Like, it's been done in parts and pieces, but you'd have to be crazy to want to do it all in one, chunk of a couple movies. Really what it is it's a collection of stories, some longer, some shorter, that some of which are not quite finished, which is unfortunate because Tolkien probably wanted to kind of flesh them out more. But unfortunately, thankfully, due to Christopher, his son, this is the part of the video where I will have good things to say about Christopher Tolkien. Stay tuned towards the second half of the video where I might have some less than positive things to say about him. But in this part, without him, we would never have known about the first and second ages of Middle-earth. All we would have is the appendices, which is a fraction of the length of what the Silmarillion gives us, and it's sort of like a Spark Notes version of the events of the First and Second Age, and even before the First Age, because technically there was a prehistory, obviously. So an example of books that were later published in the 90s, there was a book called The History of Middle-earth, and I never got that one, but there was another one that was also published at one point. I actually haven't read this yet, but this was just republished with this beautiful Alan Lee slipcover here called The Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth. So there's a lot more about the Second Age in this that I have not read yet, which is kind of sad considering I'm filming this video, but it's perfect time to read in lieu of this new show. So by the time I review this whole show at the end of the year, I will probably have read this, especially the parts of it that pertain to the Second Age. Because, the Second Age is talked about in the Silmarillion, but it's a really small portion of the book. Most of the book is about the First Age. Tolkien didn't write as much about the Second Age, which of course gives the showrunners a bit of a difficult story to adapt. Christopher Tolkien also went to the lengths of publishing versions of the small stories that you can find in the Silmarillion from the First Age into standalone novels. Here's The Children of Hurin. And then I also have The Fall of Gondolin. This one has another beautiful Alan Lee illustration on it. I've read both of these. This one's relatively recent. This one came out in 2007. Now, speaking of TV show adaptations, these are much smaller texts, as you can tell, but there's a lot packed into them. They could also be, a series of movies. They could be a movie, maybe two, maybe three. These could easily be the next Peter Jackson epic. But unfortunately, and as I'm getting to with all of this, by showing all of this, guess what Amazon has the rights to? Nothing that I just showed you. So all these books, all these wonderful pieces of literature that Christopher Tolkien has given us, and there's a new one actually coming out with the editing help of Brian Sibley, because Christopher Tolkien has since passed away. He passed away in early 2020. That is going to cover the Second Age even more in depth. And it's coming out in tandem with this Amazon show. But the frustrating thing is, at the end of the day, none of these books actually have the rights sold to anyone outside of the Tolkien estate. So what Amazon purchased the rights for when back in 2000 and well, okay, let's start. This sets me up for the beginning of my discussion about this for this TV show. So these are novels that I would love to see adapted into film or television. I don't know when. Obviously, there's the issue of copyright, so we might have to wait a long time for that. And unfortunately, I'm not holding my breath. And it was something that, again, all these years after, and especially after the Hobbit films, I was sort of like, okay, we got the Hobbit. We know that this is Peter Jackson's last foray into Middle Earth. He said definitively that there was nothing else he wanted to do with the franchise. I mean, he knew that there was no more things he had the rights to. He'd already done the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. His job was done. And I agree that, I didn't disagree with him on that. Maybe someone else could take on that legacy in the future. But it was disheartening to know that it could be such a long time before we saw Tolkien brought to life in the visual form again, unless someone was to just remake The Lord of the Rings. In comes Amazon. So in the fall of 2017, it is announced that Amazon had bought the rights for roughly, I believe, $200 million, if I'm not mistaken, to acquire the entire Lord of the Rings and Hobbit books, including the appendices, from the Tolkien estate. This was probably like one of the largest rights bought purchases in modern history. It is producing a show that is going to potentially cost even more, with the budget overall for 5 seasons, which is what is predicted at a minimum for this show and what Amazon ordered to be over $1 billion US. So this is going to be the most expensive television series ever created, far more expensive than Game of Thrones. Now, Game of Thrones was something that the head of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, was stewing over. And obviously, he directly basically stated at the time of the press release that he wanted to bring Game of Thrones to Amazon. Give me a television show that is going to match the viewership and notoriety that Game of Thrones has given HBO Max. And interestingly, this was before the final 2 seasons of that show aired, because it's noticed I never watched Game of Thrones, and I will preface this video. It might be shocking to some people, because a lot of Tolkien fans, some of them think Game of Thrones is like, how can you not like it when you like Tolkien? And others are like, no, they are very different. And I'm on the side of these two shows. Just because you like one doesn't mean you're going to like the other, okay? Yes, they're both medieval fantasy epics with some magic thrown in. But Game of Thrones, to me, was a lot more violent. It was a lot more... Some of the things that Christopher Tolkien describes in the Peter Jackson film adaptations as things he doesn't like, I see a lot more of that in Game of Thrones. I don't see it so much in the Peter Jackson films. So Game of Thrones, to me, I also never had HBO Max. I've got to be honest with you. Growing up, we didn't have it. And it aired when I was only 18, premiered when I was only 18. So I didn't have access to it. By the time it was too far along and I just didn't care. Apparently, the show ended actually pretty lacklusterly and fans were very disappointed, which to me was sort of like a ha-ha, all right, well, I don't feel so bad for never jumping on that train, but here we go. Interestingly, HBO is kind of dissing Amazon here by dropping a reboot, a spin-off series called House of the Dragon, as I'm filming this coming Sunday, which is just 2 weeks before Rings of Power premieres. Game of Thrones has been off the air for 3 years. And so Rings of Power isn't going to have its own time to shine. It's going to be competing once again. It's going to be competing directly with this Game of Thrones spinoff called House of the Dragon. I don't know if that show is going to do nearly as well. I don't know. I haven't heard as much about it. Maybe it won't. But it's a bit of a thorn in Jeff Bezos' side. Which unfortunately, normally I would be rooting for Lord of the Rings and I would be rooting for Amazon. But the fact that it is Amazon and the fact that it is Jeff Bezos the Dark Lord Sauron himself, who is at the helm of all of this. I mean, he doesn't have anything to do with the production of the show, but he was the one who kind of ultimately made this come to fruition. Um, yeah, it's unfortunate that, a company that has so problematic, so kind of the antithesis of, what I would of New Line Cinema back in the day, for example, when Peter Jackson used New Line before they got acquired by Warner Brothers. It's I would feel a lot safer knowing this series was in the hands of an A24 or, a I don't know, just something. Keep it away from Disney. Keep it away from, yeah, keep it away from all those Amazon, even Netflix. Netflix can have, some really, really stellar stuff out there. Some guy, Netflix is a mixed bag for me. Amazon is interesting because, to be honest, in 2017, we found out the show was being ordered. I thought that this meant Amazon Prime was going to start really pumping out a lot of original content, scripted content. And to this day, over the years, I don't think I've seen Amazon Prime spending as much money or promoting as many new shows as other platforms have. I feel like Amazon Prime has probably thrown so much into this series that they're only focusing on tentpole series. They're not sort of just doing the Netflix model of dropping a million different shows at once and then canceling half of them because most of them are terrible. Um, Amazon did do an adaptation of another beloved fantasy novel series that I have never read called The Wheel of Time. The first season premiered last year, and it's unfortunately not looking good for Rings of Power if Wheel of Time is anything to go off of, because from what I've seen people say, that the adaptation for it was, for people who love the books, a disaster. And the season was just not very good. It looked interesting to me, but I don't have any, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if I'm going to watch it at some point. I don't know. I've not really been familiar with that fantasy series. Forgive me. I have been watching The Witcher on Netflix, which was the other sort of big, fantasy series that got picked up by one of these studios recently. And there's some parallels going on I can see in the way that The Witcher's going and the way this show is going. You can see it across a lot of different franchises, Star Wars, Star Trek. I don't know of a lot of these franchises that in depth, but we're going to have some common themes here. So Amazon is the one who gets the rights. The mandate is give us our own Game of Thrones from Jeff Bezos. New Line Cinema, a part of Warner Brothers now, did give the rights to the Amazon Prime to use parts of the Peter Jackson films, not necessarily parts of the films, but to keep continuity in terms of imagery. And we do have some overlap in terms of teams working on particularly the special effects as well as some of the conceptual art. So in the early years, this was over 4 years ago, there was a lot of speculation about, what was the studio given the rights for? What is the studio trying to pitch? And who's going to be at the helm of this? There were a lot of different directors, some from Game of Thrones, some from others that were coming in. And at the end of the day, two relatively young showrunners in Hollywood, they're both American, by the way, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, were revealed to be the head honchos. Filming did take place for season 1 in New Zealand. It actually, New Zealand was used for the Jackson films, for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, so, why not go back there? The Weta Workshop, which has worked with more than just the Jackson films since The Lord of the Rings, for special effects and makeup design and for prosthetics and for prop design, was once again involved, which, again, one of the positives about this whole project. And slowly we started to see names, popping up that we didn't know who was going to be in the cast. And eventually we did find out that we knew that this was going to be about the Second Age of Middle-earth, though it wasn't until relatively recently that we found out what the title of the show was. That wasn't back until February. The show was called Rings of Power, and that we got a first real teaser for it. The first image that we got almost a year ago now, at the end of August of 2021, was a shot of what we believe to be some elven figure. in front of a city in what appears to be the first age in Valinor, which is, for people who are not so familiar, though I don't think you'd be watching this if you aren't, Valinor is the place where the elves go to, and it's kind of where they're meant to be. It was a land created for the immortal elves on Earth, but it's not really Earth, and especially by the time of the Third Age, it's kind of more heaven in that idea of it, because it doesn't exactly exist on the same plane anymore as the world that Arda or Middle Earth exists. Back at one point in the First Age, they were closer together, meaning you could actually technically sail to it without having to ascend so much so. You know how at the end of the Return of the King, it's more like symbolic of them dying when they sail off than it is necessarily anything else. That's alluding to the fact that it's not as easy to get to Valinor anymore. Anyway, that's digressing. We got the premiere date, September 2nd. And actually, I just looked, and apparently, we are going to be getting 2 episodes on Friday, September 2nd. And then they are going to be airing another episode each week. There are 8 episodes to this first season. So, I'm going to withhold filming my review video until I've seen, obviously, all 8 episodes, which means the last one will probably come out around the end of October. So November time is probably when I'm going to film my review of this series. But I like that they're spreading the episodes out. It gives us a little bit binge watching things. I find myself with some of my favorite shows like trying to hold myself back, because when you binge something, it's over in like a couple days. And if you're waiting sometimes years for a show and then it's over so quickly, I don't know. Sometimes it's nice to binge, but I prefer to spread things out, especially a show where I really want to marinate in each episode. And visually, we're definitely going to have a lot to marinate in. It's just, do we have a lot of story here that's going to be compelling? That's the real question. So it's important to probably also mention that, why this show is actually happening now. Warner Brothers was actually involved with a pretty lengthy lawsuit with the Tolkien estate after the Peter Jackson films. It had something to do with the fact that it had something to do with merchandising, particularly with slot machines. I don't remember the details. There was also some controversy that perhaps some of the Tolkien estate was not making as much money from weren't making as much royalties as they were promised from the original films, and so on and so forth. So it took many years for them to settle in court. And that's another reason why there's such a long gap. That's why it's only until 2017 that both parties came to a agreement that they could move forward, and the Tolkien estate could start selling the rights to other outlets like Amazon. They also approached Netflix. They did approach HBO. Amazon was the one who happened to buy it out. So the premise of the show is the Second Age. And as I already mentioned, the Second Age is not nearly as well documented in the Silmarillion, or as far as I'm aware, as in Unfinished Tales, as the First Age. So again, the Lord of the Rings takes place in the Third Age, for those of you, again, who maybe need a refresher. The Second Age is demarcated sort of by, the end of the First Age is the fall of Morgoth. Morgoth is, if you think Sauron's the bad guy, Sauron is chump change. Sauron is, the chump on the block. He was the servant of Morgoth in the First Age. Sauron was sort of like, consider him like a lesser angel to Lucifer. Like he was just one of his minions. So the actual Lucifer figure was Morgoth. He was originally called Melkor, and he was one of the original creator gods of the universe. He was the one that caused discord amongst the others. And so that is part of the reason why the world is so, in my understanding of it, in Tolkien's Legendarium, it is one of the reasons for discord in the reality of our existence. The First Age, they are just really struggling against this guy. This guy is like just, wreaking havoc, destroying things that are so sacred, especially in Valinor, the Undying Lands. It's a big reason why Valinor had to be sort of made even more inaccessible to anyone besides the Eldar race, the race of elves, and further out of reach of humans. And then Morgoth is defeated in this really big battle, this cataclysmic battle, a battle so big that it actually sinks a huge portion of Middle Earth into the ocean. So there's a map that shows Beleriand, as it was called in the first age, which is actually further west of everything you see in the maps of Middle Earth in the Peter Jackson films. So the Shire is suddenly very far east of all of these pieces of land that the first age, most of the dramas take place in. But there are these, huge continental reshaping kind of things in the wars that take place. It's basically the God Wars at the end, because the gods, the head honchos of Valinor, they ultimately destroy Morgoth. Well, they throw him into the void, and Morgoth is gone. Morgoth is gone, but his influence, his infection, is prevalent. He just because he's gone doesn't mean that evil is vanquished. And so, for a relative period of time, there's a restabilization of Middle Earth. Middle Earth is very changed, and that's where we enter the Second Age. And again, keep in mind, my knowledge of this is rusty. I'm going to be rereading a lot of this lore. I don't want to spend too long going over it, but I'm interested to see where the show is going to be covering some things. I do know, unfortunately, that there is going to be some time condensing. That's one of the big concerns I have, as many Tolkien fans have. And so Sauron, it takes him a little while to get back on his feet, but Sauron ultimately is the one who starts to cause the discord. Evil is rising again. He creates all of these rings. He gives 9 of them to men, these kings of men. They all get immediately corrupted by it. He gives 7 rings to dwarf lords. They also all meet terrible fates they're kind of cursed for the dwarves. And then he gives 3 to the elves. The elves are the ones who actually use their rings for good. Galadriel is one of them. Gil-galad is another. Gil-galad, who we will see in this Rings of Power show. And Círdan, who I'm not entirely sure if we are going to see. I haven't heard anything about Círdan being, a part of at least this first season. So I'm not entirely sure if he has been casted. Galadriel is the only one in the Third Age who is still bearing these rings, because Gil-galad unfortunately dies in the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age. So, spoiler alert. So his ring is passed on to Elrond. Elrond has the ring in the Third Age, and the ring of Círdan is given to Gandalf in the Third Age. And of course, Galadriel still has hers, and it's the reason why she gets even more powerful in the Third Age. And Galadriel is going to be very important, apparently, in this show. If you've seen any of the teasers, any of the marketing, she is sort of one of the big main characters, which is kind of interesting because I've always loved Galadriel as a character. I mean, Cate Blanchett is phenomenal in the Peter Jackson films. Even in The Hobbit, where she's really kind of shoehorned in, she's not really supposed to be there. I mean, she is and she isn't. The Hobbit films utilize material from the appendices to kind of show what's going on at the same time as Bilbo and the dwarves are doing their excursions. I get their decision to do it. It is kind of cool to see Saruman and Elrond and Galadriel, the White Council, and all of that. But, the way it's done, it definitely isn't quite, it feels a little bit haphazard. It feels a little bit fan fiction-y because Tolkien never directly wrote about these events. And especially in the Tale of the Hobbit, it feels a little bit misplaced. The scope of the tale is just very different from Bilbo and his journey. But, Galadriel is one of those characters who, does appear in the Silmarillion from the Lord of the Rings, along with Elrond and Celeborn to a certain extent, her husband in Lothlorien. And, when I initially saw the casting, I was very excited to see where they were going to go with, these stories that are, Galadriel's story is a little bit, there's some contradictions in Tolkien's text, and that's with the History of Middle Earth, Finished Tales. There's stuff I need to read through there, but the overall gist of her story I seem to recall, and I think we'll be seeing a lot of that, but again, it's going to be convoluted here. So let's get into the controversy, shall we? So there are a lot of reasons why this show has become very controversial. And I'm just going to sort of go through these, and then after I list them all, I'm going to go through point by point and sort of share what people say, why I feel like this is valid, and also why I might disagree in certain cases. The first thing we've got to talk about, and this is something that, unfortunately, it's really it's something that's not just plaguing the Amazon. It's not just plaguing Rings of Power. And when I mean like plaguing it, well, we're going to talk about racism. Basically, we're going to talk about the fact that there is a huge attack from, unfortunately, it seems people who are a little bit more on the right side of politics, not the left. But there is overlap of criticizing forced diversity or wokeism. The rings of woke is what people are considering, or people are trashing the series to be. It's something that in this day and age, in 2022, it's going to be a little bit of a dilemma for some show creators. If I were the one behind the show, it would be something I would think long and hard about, because even the Peter Jackson films, even though it was only 20 years ago, we were at a very different time in terms of fighting for diversity on screen. I mean, that battle had started long before that, but post Black Lives Matter, post the sort of renaissance of, especially in the last decade, reconstructing a lot of mainstream media to be more racially equitable. The fact that Peter Jackson's films don't have any people of color in them would be considered problematic today, even though by Tolkien literary standards, it would be pretty accurate. So unfortunately, we have a real rift that's coming out between, people who are excited to see diversity, and people who understand that in this day and age, and the fact that it is a fictional setting at the end of the day, we've got make believe characters. Is it, that much of a stretch to believe that an elf can be of a different skin tone? Elves don't exist anyway, right? I believe they do, but you know what I mean by that. And I don't want to argue with that too much, but unfortunately, we do kind of run the issue of tokenism. And I have seen, with some of the images and some of the ways that the press have been, and the way the show actually has been promoting itself, putting a lot of these characters who are not in the original text, but are sort of symbols of, a female character, or a black female character, or a black character of color. They're sort of becoming the spokesperson for the show to the media, in some ways more than the characters who are playing some of the more established, Celebrimbors and Gil-galads of the Second Age. They're sort of in the background. The white men are in the background. We don't want to hear from them. Because, a story about Tolkien, yeah, it's going to have a lot of white men, not as many women, though. The Silmarillion has a fair amount of female characters, okay? Way more than The Lord of the Rings, even. It depends what story you're picking, but there's a lot of female characters. And female characters that I think are, they're not all just pretty princesses who don't do anything. But yes, at the end of the day, this is a story that Tolkien wrote that is full of men, full of white men, okay? He wrote this as sort of an ancient history of Britain. And, I'll debate this with some people. I heard one person say that ancient England and ancient Northern Europe wasn't all white. So why not, showcase all the different, hues that people came in at that time? That doesn't necessarily give the show an excuse to, exclude any people of color. And I was like, really? I'm pretty sure people of color were very minority in that time period. I mean, there's things that happened, it depends how far back we're going here, but, the intermixing of cultures is a relatively new thing. So I don't necessarily buy the whole kind of, England is, historically a diverse country. No, it's diverse today. It's not historically diverse, at least outside of European, gene groups. So yeah, he was writing it from that viewpoint, and from different, sort of Viking and Northern European epics. And it's sort of like if you were to read the Mahabharata, or if you were to read the Bhagavad Gita, for example, in India, I would assume that everyone in the story is brown. Everyone is of some sort of Indus Valley descent, because that's the story of their culture, of their lands as they came to be. So I do think that, you can't add sort of historical. I just don't really think. Now that doesn't mean that you can't, occasionally. So okay, we've got different races on Middle Earth. Okay, we have the elves, who are considered the firstborn. They were awoken first by the gods. That's why they're called the firstborn. The elves are sort of like, the better version of humans. And this could get a little controversial when I say some things later, when I say that elves don't seem to have so much diversity in skin tone as humans do. But I read somewhere that someone said that Tolkien, in some writings, might have hinted at the fact that even elves in the Middle Earth we know, the northern part of Middle Earth, because we are aware that there's a southern and far eastern section of that continent that he doesn't talk about. That there might be elves of different skin tones, that they're not all super pale white as they're depicted often. And so, I'm not going to challenge that. At the end of the day, if you want to show elves of different skin tones, go for it. Do you want to make Galadriel or Elrond or any of the, major elfish characters a different skin tone? Probably not, especially if you want continuity with the Jackson films. But, if you want to throw in extras who are diverse, that's great. I would do the same thing. But as we know from the show, we are seeing a black elf as one of the main characters. His name is Arondir, I believe. Very good looking. And he is sporting a very modern hairstyle, which is not only too modern for medieval lore. It's funny, I was watching The Tudors the other day, and everyone has these nice buzz cuts, and my mom was like, "This is not historically accurate." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, it looks better. I like men with short hair." But the ironic thing is even though I think men do look better with short hair, my elves do not have short hair, okay? From my understanding, elves, the way Tolkien describes them, they have long, straight hair. So it is disappointing to see elves with very modern hairstyles. You've got we've got one elf that looks like Steve Harrington from Stranger Things. Okay, Elrond looks like Steve Harrington. He's got the '80s hairstyle. I mean, I'm just like, what are we doing here? And you could do cool things with, especially with black elves. You could do cool braids and stuff. That would, I think, be really interesting. But the shaved buzz head cut look, no, I don't. I don't think that's where I want to see our elf depiction going here. People are saying elves. The showrunners are explaining that elves haven't always looked the same. I mean, if anything, the elves would start getting more diverse in look later on. Not necessarily in the third age, we're seeing them all look the same, but in the second age, they're all looking different, and then they all go to looking the same. Granted, there aren't nearly as many elves on Middle Earth, even in the second age, but by the third age, there definitely aren't very many elves on Middle Earth. And by the fourth age, there are none. The third age ends with the destruction of the ring and Frodo and Galadriel sailing off into the Grey Havens, and so Elrond eventually goes later as well, and then there's like no elves left on Middle Earth. But as far as elves are concerned, my whole thing is Arondir's character. I'm going to get to this as a recurring thought thing. It's more about the writing. That's what I care more about. I don't really care. It can be a great character, and obviously it's an invented character. So yeah, I'm a little bit, knowing what they've done with invented characters, particularly in The Hobbit, I'm a little bit concerned about some of these plot lines they're going to be interjecting here, especially the sort of romancy plot lines that they're going to throw in. I believe they do have a romance between an elf and a human. I think Arondir is involved with that. It's a little bit like a Slytherin being with a Gryffindor in Hogwarts. Like, that just doesn't happen. You don't get a lot of inter-elven man relationships. That's why Arwen and Aragorn were such a big deal. And there's an earlier prototype of that named Beren and Luthien, another epic story from the Silmarillion, but I have no time to talk about this. The most, beautiful story from there, and it's the ultimate love story. But with that being said, let's talk about the dwarves. Okay, so we've got this character Disa. The actress who plays her is so proud to, talk about how diversity is going to open up new doors for people of color to get into Tolkien's world, into the Lord of the Rings. And at the end of the day, I'm not, what am I'm all for that. I am all for this. Like at the end of the day, people of color being in fantasy stories that are invented characters, as long as the character serves a good purpose in the show, I don't have a problem with it. At the end of the day, you're a racist if this stuff bothers you that much, especially just that in itself. You can't stand to see brown people in Middle Earth. That's a you problem, okay? Because at the end of the day, I can live with it, okay? I don't necessarily want to see, an adaptation of historical like stuff of any race be switched. I do want that historical accuracy, but this is fantasy, okay? And Disa is a character Tolkien never wrote. However, people have pointed out that it's one thing to have black elves, but black dwarves do not make logistical sense in the fact that dwarves spend 80% of their lives underground in caves, a lot of the time not even getting much light. So where are they getting this melanin? Why would dwarves have brown, darker skin? That is a good question, and unfortunately, it defies the logic of the fact that we're seeing diversity in the dwarves of this Middle Earth that we're entering into through Amazon. Though, again, it's not something I'm losing sleep over, okay? Yes, it's an oversight that I think if I were creating the show, I would probably avoid, because at the end of the day, the area where you can have the most fun with diversity is in the race of human. They call them men, but they're the humans of Middle Earth. They're us. We come in all the colors. And so the secondborn, the humans, have fun with that. Give us as much representation in that as you can, including the Numenorians. And so I just wish they had focused on the diversity there, and then maybe the diversity in the elves and the dwarves could just be in like backup characters, because we see that in like the Hobbit films. We actually see that a little bit in the Peter Jackson films. Just some extras that, color things, spice it up a little bit. But giving the main characters outside of the men, the humans, I'm not so sure I would do that. There are also races of humans called the Haradrim from the south and the Easterlings. Now, there's some copious sort of inspiration that Tolkien might have been deriving, let's be real, from the 1930s and 40s, which was a much more racist time, particularly in Europe, of comparing these kind of groups to actual people groups that are further south in Africa or further east in the and so I can understand why they want to well, I can and I can't. I would personally try and use the framework that Tolkien's given you and to create diversity that way, but Amazon has decided that anyone can be any race, and you got a problem with it, then you're a racist, as Morfydd Clark pointed out so aptly on her Instagram in a very direct, very sort of jaded Instagram story. You all need to shut the F up. I'm going to talk about Morfydd because there's been some things she's been saying in the media, and of course with this Instagram story, it's not giving the show a good look. So look, I don't know of anything in the story that's about, gender identity and everything. I'm sure that, the people who are all up in arms about diversity in the show are probably also thinking, oh, there's going to be, Sauron's going to be transgender, and oh my God, they're going to have and it's just, they're so homophobic and transphobic and xenophobic that they can't fathom the idea of that fitting into Tolkien's story. Because yeah, he doesn't have any of that. But I see both sides here, because the ultimate argument is that Tolkien is not trying to pull from, supposedly, his own political, allegorical influences and thoughts on life. Tolkien's Middle Earth is Middle Earth. It's not influenced by the politics of today. And a lot of people are upset that Amazon is going in the direction of telling a story, as J.D. Payne and the other show writer, Patrick McCleary, what's his name, have said even, we're trying to bring Middle Earth to today, basically. And that's upset a lot of people. And I can understand why. I think there's a way to meet in the middle. I think there's a way to meet in the middle. You still honor the sort of sanctity of Tolkien's work as it was written without interjecting your own thoughts into it. But you also, in certain areas, do things to boost some representation when you can, or little things here and there in the writing that can show that the world is it's not it's not entirely encapsulated in this ancient prehistory time where we're all using thou and hast, and we're all old fashioned, because a lot of times you got more modern language coming into these shows anyway, so you break that fourth wall a little bit. So in some of the humor we can interject a little bit of 2020 language. But anyway, look, that's something I could harp on and on about. At the end of the day, I any critiques that I might have about how the show is handling diversity are overshadowed by the fact that I'm seeing a lot of vitriol being directed at anyone who is even liking the idea of watching the show, not just people involved with it, from these Tolkien fans, and you can see them. There's just video and video after video on YouTube. They're just so angry, and I'm just like, calm down, okay? It's not the end of the world. Yes, Diza doesn't have a beard, or it's like very hidden. It's a little weird, and I'm like still kind of, is this the best adaptation of Tolkien that's ever going to be? Probably not. But you know what? We might not get another one for another 100 years. So we've got to sit down and deal with this. Okay. Tom Shippey being fired. So he was a Tolkien scholar who was fired in early 2020. He was early on involved with the show. A lot of people are upset because his firing, although Amazon says that he was dismissed because they no longer needed him, but there's difference in what Tom Shippey has said. He has expressed Tom Shippey left because no, he didn't like the way the show was going. So no, they didn't fire him. He left, but it wasn't like he wanted to leave originally. He was probably upset about the way they are condensing the timeline and changing a lot of the essence of the Second Age story. We are going to be having things happen that were supposed to be hundreds and hundreds of years apart, all happening within the space of presumably about 10 years, I believe they said, in the first 5 seasons. And there's a lot of things that and again, I have to reread the story to know the details, but from what I've heard and what I remember, and from what I've heard them say, the showrunners say that one of the reasons why they didn't like the idea of, as they put it, making a documentary of Middle Earth, which I think would be awesome, like a docudrama of Middle Earth, like episodically going through each 100-year block with all these stories, and then they don't like the idea that you're going to be losing a lot of characters because of mortality. Hello, the elves don't die, okay, unless in battle. So the elves are a huge part of the Second Age. You're going to be getting all of them. Sauron doesn't die. He's going to be there the whole time. The Númenóreans, which are the race of men who are the ones who go to the special island far out in the west, almost to Valinor, not quite. They say they could almost glimpse Valinor from the hills, but they couldn't quite grasp it. They were men who, were kings of men that descended families that were, rewarded for good behavior by the Eldar and by the gods until they squandered it. The Númenórean story is definitely an allegory or a sort of reiteration of the Atlantis legend. One of the things that really pisses me off about Tolkien is he loves to say he does not support allegory. His works have no allegory whatsoever in them. Yet at the same hand, he talks about the Catholic inspiration of his work. There's a whole level of that seems a little bit disconnected to me. He's not the one to say if there's allegory or not. All works of fiction could be viewed as allegory. There is so much allegorical stuff I could pull from his works. And there's a lot of historical, tie-ins, things that, he's taken from Greek epics and other things. So Númenor is the Atlantis story, and we're supposedly going to see most of that play out in this show, and it's what I'm most excited to see. However, we're seeing Galadriel, presumably in Númenor. There's an image of her with a palantir. Palantirs are sort of these seeing stones that I do believe they did have in Númenor. They were used by the kings and people of that time, and they were also used in Gondor. and Arnor. Those are the two and big human kingdoms in Middle Earth. And they were used to communicate with one another. And Tarmiriel, who is the queen of Numenor at this point in the series that we are seeing Galadriel here, who actually in this text was never actually queen. Her husband kind of married her, and when he married her, he usurped her into the throne. So she was going to be queen, but Ar-Pharazôn took over, and she, wasn't the sole leader. But of course, I think Amazon wanted to give a female a big, powerful role. And so they made that decision. Be that as it may, these two people never met each other. Galadriel, as far as we are aware, never went to Numenor. Numenor was not really somewhere that the elves went that often. I might be wrong. I think some of them did occasionally, but it was, they had their own places. Numenor was, yeah. So Galadriel going to Numenor in the first place, I'm just like, oh my gosh. Like, no. This is the first of the issues with Galadriel's character that we're seeing here. Let's talk about the Harfoots, because another thing that I'm sure Tom Shippey got mad at, that I feel like we're being sort of gaslit by the showrunners to believe, hobbits don't exist in the Second Age. I mean, Tolkien never explicitly said that, but he does state that hobbits were of no concern to anyone until the Third Age, which would make sense, but he also kind of implied that hobbits didn't exist, that they came into the Third Age, that they started to populate. And something that, he talks about at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring is he talks about some of the ancestral races of hobbits. There's the Stors, the Fallowhides, and the Harfoots. And he talks about the Harfoots being of browner skin. And I'm sure the showrunners were like, well, that's great, because we want to give hobbits, And to be honest, I think you can give hobbits any color you want, because I'm not entirely sure that Tolkien, besides saying that one little thing, said that there's definitely no brown or black hobbits in the Shire in the Third Age. I mean, you could have probably easily fit them in. I don't think that would have been an issue for me or anyone, but I don't know. That being said, the showrunners are basically running with the idea that Harfoots existed before hobbits, so they're going to put the Harfoots in the Second Age. And they're also claiming that Harfoots are not hobbits. They're saying, well, the Harfoots are sort of like a distant relative genetically, but they're different from us. They're sort of like the difference between chimpanzees and us. Harfoots are sort of like a different evolution of hobbit that was early on. When that's not at all what Tolkien says. Harfoots are hobbits. In the Fellowship of the Ring, he describes them as hobbits. So the fact that the showrunners are twisting history here, Tolkien's history, selectively remembering certain phrases and then completely forgetting about others, and twisting things to their, their whole thing is they wanted the little people, they felt that a story without something like a hobbit in Middle-earth just didn't feel complete. It didn't feel like home. Look, I sort of get where they're coming from, okay? The hobbits in the balance of the Lord of the Rings story bring such levity and humor and innocence. They're just these short, people who love gardening. They don't want to fight battles. I mean, they're really in the spirit of Tolkien in that regard. And, if you were to adapt, for example, the First Age, but even the Second, these stories are really tragic. Okay, this is tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. Yes, there are points where good does win, but there are a lot of points where even after the triumph, the main character commits suicide, or there's, some tragic ending that eventually happens. And everyone, Game of Thrones is, I guess, sort of like that, but there's just this endless sort of stream of sorrow throughout the stories of the First and Second Age. And hobbits bring a levity to that. And it is easier to sort of put some more humor into the dialogue by having these sort of people who are not a part of the mechanisms of commerce and, political goings on of the world. They're just, I saw people marching through, strange folk are abroad. That perspective, that outsider perspective as a storytelling device, I get it. It's enticing. And for them to not have that in this story, they probably felt like they couldn't go without it. At the end of the day, I'm not going to lament it too much. It doesn't offend me to the umpteenth degree. Again, the condensing of the timeline and putting Galadriel where she's not supposed to be, and some other things I'm going to get to, offend me way more than including Harfoots, who are supposedly not hobbits, but are for all intents and purposes hobbits. They look very similar. Anyway, so we've got all that going on. But let's talk about Galadriel, okay? Let's talk about Galadriel. Morfydd Clark is a Welsh actress. It's Morfydd, Morfydd, if you pronounce it in Welsh. First of all, spot on casting. When I saw the casting, I was like, she looks like a young Kate Blanchett. I was kind of like, this was a smart choice. The first couple images we saw of her, though, were very different from anything that we would have associated Kate Blanchett's Galadriel with. She is armored up with her sword and she is leading battles. She is a general in this series, from what we can tell. She is an army captain. She is sort of like the one who is just, I mean, she's basically like Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings from what we've been seeing. She's the female Aragorn. She's also looks a lot in this, it's also looks, but in just the character, I'm seeing a lot of parallels with The Witcher and Ciri, Freya Allan's character. Not only do they look alike and are central to the plot, but I can sense there's a similar sort of girl boss, Mulan sort of story going on here where it's like, I can do just what the men do and I will be just as strong and powerful in battle. That story, which is, explored wonderfully through Eowyn in the Lord of the Rings. But that's not Galadriel's story. That is absolutely against anything Tolkien ever wrote about Galadriel. And trust me, Tolkien was a little all over the map with Galadriel, especially in the Second Age. Was she in Lindon for this long? When did she meet Celeborn? When did she go to Lothlorien? There's a little bit of, did she necessarily participate in the Kingslaying and Alcalonde? That's in the First Age, or was she not a part of that? There's some discrepancies. Don't get me wrong, Galadriel is a powerful warrior in a certain sense. And Galadriel is proven to be a match for Sauron. Obviously, we see in the Hobbit films, she does her own sort of banishment of Morgoth, so to speak. Using the ring, Nenya, she has such power to sort of send him back to Barad-dûr. So she clears Dol Guldur and she lays bare its pits at the end of The Lord of the Rings. A lot of that, again, though, is due to the fact that she has her ring. Now, obviously, at the beginning of this, she doesn't have that. And Galadriel is very, very old. It sort of bugs me a little bit when the showrunners talk about like Galadriel and Elrond. They sort of talk about them as being, well, they're a lot younger in this series. And so they're going to be a lot more, a little less polished and a little rough around the edges compared to how you see them in their sort of more regal, stately, elderly, sort of decorum in the Lord of the Rings films. And I'm like, Elrond's one thing, but at the beginning of the Second Age, Galadriel is, my guesstimations, at least 2,000 years old. Now, granted, she's about 8,000 years old when the ring is destroyed, but she's probably older than that, 3,000, 4,000. Thousands of years old. She was born before the First Age. She was born in the Year of the Trees. The Year of the Trees is before the sun and the moon existed on Earth. The trees, Telperion and Lorelin, they were these waxing and waning, fiery and lunar-colored trees that lit up and, gave light to Valinor. At a time when Middle-earth was in complete darkness, if I'm not mistaken. There weren't many people on Middle-earth at that period of time. She is of one of the clans or houses of the Feanor, who is this huge figure in the Silmarillion. He's the one who creates the Silmarils. So she is descended from him, and the Noldor. The Noldor are the more warrior-like elves of Valinor. There's different inner races of elves. I don't know if you'd call them races or clans or houses. I'm not sure how you delineate them. But the Noldor were the ones who ended up going back to Middle-earth. The ones who kind of, they were invited to Valinor and they said, you know what? We want to go back. We want to see what Middle-earth's all about. And so Feanor led that charge. So she was mighty in her own right, very powerful. She did have sort of telekinetic powers. She could read people's minds. She could even peer into Sauron's mind. And that was something she had before the Ring of Nenya, which gave her extra power to sort of fortify Lothlorien against Sauron. But she's presented always as this serene, stately, prideful character. And prideful is important because, yes, that is a part of how they describe this Galadriel in the Rings of Power. But she did not lead the charge, so to speak, on the horseback and with that javelin in hand. She was doing things. She's an interesting sort of example of feminine power that's not necessarily having to equate to masculine power. She's a very powerful character. In fact, she's one of the most powerful people, or definitely one of the most powerful elves on Middle Earth. But she's not necessarily taking part in battles. That's just not where she is involved. I mean, she did, go on great adventures. She crossed the Helcarax, which was this giant ice world that connected Valinor to Middle Earth in the First Age, and that was no undertaking. I mean, she's done a lot of things. She's traveled very far, and she is exceedingly wise. But the Galadriel that it appears that we are going to be seeing in this show is going to be, blending the masculine idea of power and the feminine idea that Cate Blanchett
shall be.
I just don't know how I feel about that. And I know a lot of Tolkien fans are kind of like, this is just not her character. And in some ways, it would almost be like if you wanted to give a female elven warrior badass character, like make up another one, but don't make it Galadriel, because her character is just, I don't know, her character is kind of sacred to me. One of my favorites. And I'm excited to see how Morfydd portrays her, but I'm also really worried. I just think at the end of the day, it's going to be very, I just worry that an understanding of the character and the different kind of power that she wields is not really understood by the showrunners or by Morfydd in the way she describes her in some interviews. So yeah, we're getting girl boss Galadriel, who, is in every single battle, and wearing the armor. Apparently, it looks like she's in some sort of romance in the latest trailer with this guy named Halbrand, this man. Galadriel, we've not known of any sort of no. Yeah, it was a while before she met Celeborn. She didn't meet him well until into the Second Age, but yeah, supposedly we are going to meet him later in the series, but yeah, so I'm worried that they're going to give her all these kinds of weird showmances and just nonsensical story arcs. They're going to put her in places that she's not supposed to be. Yeah, it ain't working. It ain't working for me. Look, to not harp on too much about it, at the end of the day, with all this controversy, there is, with some of the teasers, we've been seeing sort of a generic fantasy feel coming through. There is an over-reliance on CGI. Though Weta Workshop being involved, some of the shots that we're seeing, it does have some, and I've heard some of the sets, they are doing their very best to recreate what they can. I think, the over-reliance on CGI might not be as bad as the Hobbit films, but I don't think it'll be quite to the practical effects sort of standard of the Lord of the Rings films. Unfortunately, that's a trend we're seeing in all of Hollywood in the last 20 years. But something I want to illustrate about someone I saw made a really great point about how because I'm seeing detailed shots, like there's this detailed shot of Numenor. And I mean, I zoom in on it and it's like, I'm seeing so much rich detail here. It looks like a video game, but it looks like a damn good video game, okay? Like it's a beautiful city that they're creating, and there seems to be a lot of detail in the architecture. John Howe is involved, not Alan Lee, but they were a duo who worked really well on the Jackson films. John Howe being a part of the continuity of the architecture and design and feel of Lord of the Rings is definitely something I'm happy about. But time will tell when we watch the show how much of the costuming and how much of the overall feel of the sets and the visuals that we're seeing really feel like actual care and cultural thought went into the creation of this. Do people really understand the cultural worlds that they're, injecting themselves into, that Tolkien wrote so much about? A good example that unfortunately is leading us to believe that the show is not going in that direction compared to the Jackson films has to do with Galadriel and her eyes. There's a shot of the young younger, Galadriel, Morphith, shown in comparison with Kate Blanchett when she's, in Lothlorien in particular. The set designers actually did something really, really brilliant and interesting in that they set up all these Christmas lights over all of the rigging of the camera equipment in front of Kate Blanchett, so that when the shots were in her eyes, and there are a lot of really great eye shots of her, you saw these twinkling lights in her iris. That was something that was so smart and so subtle that you wouldn't normally pick up on, but it adds to the overall power and also sorrow of her eyes, the magic of her eyes. And it leads to the feeling of this being a person who has seen so much and has so much power and wisdom. It also is also reminiscent of the fact that Galadriel has, and she's one of the last remaining in Middle Earth, who's not in Valinor, who remembers the light of the two trees. She's one of the last few people who has seen that, and it still lives in her eyes, as Tolkien writes. And so depicting that by using Christmas lights in that way, in those scenes, is just an added sort of level of above and beyond that Peter Jackson and his creative team showed in their love for this film, that went above just making something that's Game of Thrones action, woohoo! Let's create everything. Let's just create a smorgasbord of, The Witcher and Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and let's just have fun. And it's like, no. That's not what this is, okay? This is not generic fantasy fest. But unfortunately, what we're seeing in contrast in a lot of these teasers is not giving us a feeling of distinct Tolkien level of detail, and things that really bring the sets and characters to life in a way that make them feel less generic and in costume. And so I shout out to the video of the YouTuber I saw who pointed that out, because that is probably the best example I've seen illustrating so far the difference between the level of detail and effort that seems to be putting into Rings of Power versus Lord of the Rings. It's concerning when the showrunners say they want to make the book that Tolkien never wrote. They said that at the San Diego Comic-Con. And then the Hollywood Reporter has an interview where the creators push back on the idea that the show is only vaguely connected to Tolkien. I just want to sort of quibble with the vaguely connected, said Patrick McKay, who is showrunner on the series along with J.D. Payne. We don't feel that way. We feel like deep roots of this show are in the books and in Tolkien, and if we didn't feel that way, we'd all be terrified to sit up here. We feel that this story isn't ours. It's a story we're stewarding that was here before us and was waiting in those books to be on Earth. We don't feel vaguely connected. We feel deeply, deeply connected to those folks and work every day to even be closer connected. That's really how we think about it. There's a lot of pushback that these showrunners are trying so hard to impress on us that they know Tolkien better than almost anyone, when in reality, some things are pointing to the direction, and we see the finished product so far. Is that really the case? Is that what you're actually showing us? Your words are not matching your actions. And ultimately, of course, that's going to be what we see when we finally watch the show. I want to say this, fan fiction in itself, especially when you have a work that is bare bones here, we don't have a lot of the gaps, especially if you're just adapting the appendices, that is something to be expected. And fan fiction can serve a purpose. Tolkien, for better or for worse, is long dead, and the rights, for better or for worse, are in Amazon's hands. And so the right writer could write good fan fiction. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm not saying that it is impossible for you to create a show that is in the spirit of Tolkien, but filling in the gaps that he never got to finish. At the end of the day, what other choice do we have? And of course, that's something that I want to end this video talking about. So this is the part of the video where I start to lay into Christopher Tolkien a little bit, because it's quite unfortunate that the showrunners do not have a lot of material to cover. And there's a huge reason for that, okay? Christopher Tolkien has been so stubborn throughout his life, the last 20 years, so adamant that his father's works, that his published edited material of his father's works, never leave the Tolkien estate, that those rights exclusively remain locked to anyone. And it's going to probably have to be until public domain comes into effect that at this point, with any of these books, The Silmarillion, Children of Hurin, The Fall of Gondolin, Beren and Luthien, I would be very surprised if the Tolkien estate changes their tune anytime soon. Who knows? But like the can I almost I mean, look, it's sort of like Hollywood's all out of ideas, right? So why did they have to use Lord of the Rings in the first place? Jeff Bezos wanted his own Game of Thrones, so he used an IP that's well known, that's going to fill, a lot of people are going to be interested because it's Tolkien. But at the end of the day, the show they have is not there's not actually that much they can do with it because they don't have the rights to very much of it. So of course, they're going to make a ton of stuff up, and 60-70% of the show is going to be fan fiction. And you can thank Christopher Tolkien for that. I want to read an interview that Christopher Tolkien gave in 2012 to a French newspaper called Le Monde. So it was a rare time where he broke silence about the Lord of the Rings films. This was before The Hobbit came out, so one of them being, the chasm between the beauty and seriousness of the work and what it has become has gone too far for me. Such commercialization has reduced the aesthetic and philosophical impact of this creation to nothing. There is only one solution for me, turning my head away. When he talks about the Peter Jackson films, he says, they gutted the book, making an action movie for 15 to 25-year-olds, and it seems that The Hobbit will be of the same ilk. Tolkien became devoured by his popularity and absorbed by the absurdity of the time. The gap widened between the beauty, the seriousness of the work, and what it has become is beyond me. This level of marketing reduces to nothing the aesthetic and philosophical significance of this work. What he's basically saying is, the Peter Jackson films ruined Tolkien's legacy. And it's so hypocritical. Well, it's so unfortunate that he held that viewpoint when the Peter Jackson films were some of the most, galvanizing young Tolkien fan entry points into his work that there could ever be. Without the Jackson films, I would not have gotten into the Tolkien novels in the way that I have today. And I'll be honest with you, as a relatively young person, and this for older fans of Tolkien, this is going to be very different. It's hard for me to separate what the Jackson films have become from the original novels. And I haven't read the original Lord of the Rings books in a long time because, why would I, right? Because I know the story and I have read them a couple of times and I've seen the films much more. The films, and I always do feel this way sometimes about literature, a good film is sort of like the ultimate form of that piece of literature. Most books do not have the privilege of getting a film adaptation that does them justice. They're not necessarily better than the book. I don't know if that's ever really possible, especially when the book is not written necessarily forward for a movie in the first place. But the Peter Jackson films did something that very few fantasy adaptations in the last 20 years have done, which is be on par with it and rise to the occasion for what it was supposed to do, and further create, it open up the world of Middle-earth into a world that, I sometimes forget that the music of Middle-earth was not something that Tolkien actually created. That was Howard Shore. And the music to me is so integral to Middle-earth. All the themes, and it's crazy to me. And so I, as a young fan, I view the Peter Jackson films as not usurping the books, but rising to the occasion of doing full service to the books. And, granted, they've made changes too. And let's not forget remember this, I was too young, but apparently there were a lot of Tolkien purists who were sniping on the internet saying, oh, these Jackson films are going to be rubbish. They're changing this, they're changing that, blah, blah, blah. That first still shot they gave us doesn't look right. I think by this point, we can't use that argument for Rings of Power. We've seen too much. It might not be as bad as the real doomsdayers are saying, but it's probably not going to be as good as the Jackson films. That ship might have sailed based on the promotion we've seen so far and the way the showrunners are handling the interviews and press. But with that being said, Christopher Tolkien is wrong, okay? Christopher Tolkien is wrong. Yes, there's some action in there. And you know what? Did you know what your father wrote? He wrote an action epic. Do you know how violent? Do you know how violent these books are? Especially the first age? Oh my goodness. Now, he doesn't, this book is not necessarily, a story that's promoting violence. It doesn't delight in violence for violence's sake. There is an overarching meaning and power to it. But to say that the story would not be marketed to people of 15 to 25-year-olds of age, it's just like, no, you would want it to be to all ages. And there is that of the films as well. I don't know what version of the Peter Jackson films he saw, but unfortunately, apparently, if he did even see them, he really missed the mark with that. And it's just so unfortunate that that turned him off to ever coming to the negotiating table about coming into a deal with the rights to the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and his other subsequent published works of his father's. I think that, he's got this sort of superiority complex of his father's work, and his father's not even in the picture anymore. What would his father really say? I'm not sure. I think he thinks he knows his father better than he does in some cases. Now, I will say that with the Hobbit films, he was proven right. And so this is where it is tricky. Once the Hobbit films came out, I was like, oh, great, Christopher's never going to relinquish these anymore. There are younger generations of the Tolkien family who are on board. Simon Tolkien was apparently, working closely with this. So one person did point out that Simon Tolkien is very distantly removed from the mythos of his I think it's his great grandfather. I'm not entirely sure if it's his grandfather. I think he might be removed 2 generations from Christopher. But it's sort of like, anyone can have that name in the family, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But with that being said, I think the younger generation of the Tolkien estate understands that visual media is something that could serve these works well, but you just have to be scrutiny. You just have to scrutinize who you sell it to. They sold this to Amazon. What did they expect? So I don't think the Tolkien estate really cares what they do with Rings of Power. As far as they know, it's like, look, they already made the Peter Jackson films. These rights were sold in the 50s. There's not much we can do. Make what you're going to make. But Christopher would probably not be happy with this direction of the show. And unfortunately, it's proving him right about his decision to not want to sell the rights. And that's unfortunate. But it's a problem that he created, because if he wasn't so stubborn about rights, Amazon maybe would have gotten the rights to Children of Hurin or to The Fall of Gondolin, and they could have told a really epic story without having to make up as much stuff, because they would have a fleshed out narrative to work with that covers a relatively shorter period of time, which is what they want. They wouldn't have this sketched out appendix that's all they can use, with huge, huge gaps of time to make up whatever they want to further, de-Tolkienize everything about this show. So it's a catch-22, and I think Christopher Tolkien and his arrogance in that regard created this monster. And it's unfortunate. I was just taking a look a little bit at, public domain rights, and I believe it is 70 years after the death of the author. So looking at projected times where these books might come into the public domain, it's a long time from now. It's widely speculated that the Silmarillion will be available in 2043, so a little over 20 years from now, because that'll be 70 years after the death of Tolkien. However, it could fall under the death of Christopher, and he just died. So guess what? That puts us at 2090, if we want to go 70 years after his death. So under UK copyright laws, that is it's either 2043 or 2090. I'm not entirely sure. The Hobbit will be public domain relatively soon. The Hobbit will be public domain within the next 10 years. The Lord of the Rings, it'll be another 20 or so, 25. But it unfortunately, I just do think we're kind of looking at that. I just don't know the Tolkien estate moving forward. It depends how Rings of Power does. I was under the impression that when they bought the rights, they were sort of, this is what I would expect them to do. They would baby them through the process of making the show. For good behavior, they'll give them access. Okay, you can use this name of this town. You can use this character from the Silmarillion. You can use this storyline. Give them bits and pieces. That's what I thought. But unfortunately, it seems now they don't have any more than when they started. And again, why can't the Tolkien estate just be very selective and sort of say, look, we're giving you the rights exclusively, but the deal is we have to have control over this show. Like, we have to have like J.K. Rowling authority over this, okay? Like, we sign off on everything. We, this, that, I don't, yeah, I don't know. It's just, I don't know when we're ever going to see it. I hope in my lifetime I do. I hope that this Rings of Power show is good. I'm going to end on some positive notes. Boy, this is a long video. I'm sorry. I knew this was going to be long. Let's talk about some positives, shall we? The visuals and the costumes do look phenomenal. The prosthetics of the orcs look really good. Gil-galad looks awesome. And he does have the long hair, which I love. Elrond, I'm a little unsure about. They're also making Elrond this politically motivated character. Politics never seemed to be really something that interested him, especially in the Second Age, from my understanding. So again, they're changing Elrond's character just like they're changing Galadriel's. What are we going to do? The sets so far are really looking interesting. Numenor is looking beautiful. The dwarven kingdom of Moria and Khazad-dûm, from what we can see, looks absolutely amazing. Let's say one other thing I'm really excited about is the fact that Howard Shore, well, okay, I was kind of more excited at first because I heard that Howard Shore was going to be working alongside Bear McCreary on the musical score for this series. What has now come out is that Bear McCreary is actually the sole composer of the music of all of the show. Howard Shore, however, was given the privilege of composing the theme music, which means the music they play during the credits at the beginning of the show. Sort of like Hans Zimmer with The Crown. Hans Zimmer only composed that brilliant intro, and then another composer did all the soundtracks. So it's nice to see Howard Shore getting that acknowledgement. And from Bear McCreary's talking about the music, he's definitely going to take inspiration from Howard Shore and then bolster the beauty of Tolkien's world with his own spin on it. And people have told me that Bear McCreary for Battlestar Galactica, that's his biggest one he scored, and some others, he's a phenomenal composer, so that the show's in good hands with him. I've never watched a show that he scored, so that I'm aware of, but I'm holding out hope that the music and that the soundtrack, trust me, I'll be reviewing that when I review the series. I'm holding out hope that the music is going to be on par with the original trilogy. At the end of the day, I just really want to look forward to the show. It's been many years and I've been looking forward to this. And this is the best we're going to get for a long time, I think, as far as any Tolkien adaptation. And for the Tolkien purists who are already writing it off and saying, boycott it, I'm not even going to watch it, blah, 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 blah. I mean, good for you. You can do that. I'm not going to hold that against you. But don't shame us for wanting to watch it, okay? I've got to give the show the benefit of the doubt. Because at the end of the day, I won't know until I've actually seen a proper episode and even the full entire season. And who knows? Maybe the show will get better in later seasons as well. They're going to take public input and opinion and maybe mold and change the show's direction. The Witcher did that. The first season of The Witcher, the way it was structured with time was just all over the place. And the showrunners realized that that wasn't a good way to do the show. And they've changed course with the way they're kind of depicting the story moving forward. So hopefully they'll take into account fan feedback with these later seasons. It might be too late for the second season because I believe the second season may have already started production by now. And maybe even filming. I do know that they're going to be now filming in the UK instead of New Zealand. That has something to do with Amazon wanting to exclusively base their studios there. Which, at the end of the day, I don't feel like Lord of the Rings has to exclusively be in New Zealand. There's some beautiful scenery in the UK that they can film in, as well as other parts of Europe if they want to go kind of nearer to other things. So, that feels just as much as like Middle Earth as New Zealand. But Yeah, so all the racists and sort of people so anti woke, all raging about this. It's like, look, you do make some points, but I do think that you have to look in the mirror a little bit about some of this and really look at the facts that, like, at the end of the day, it's about the writing. It's about the writing, it's about the music, it's about the visuals, the art of it, is this gonna be well made? Is it gonna be paced well? I mean, there's just so many, things that need to come together, and at the end of the day, I think this is gonna be a mixed bag, and that's just the root of it. There's gonna be things about this show I really love and a lot of things I don't. And, we're gonna get at least 50 hours of Middle-earth out of this because 'cause we're getting at least 5 seasons and 8 to 10 episodes each, so we're gonna get a lot, and, that's way more than we ever got with anything else so far of Tolkien, so it's gonna be quantity over quality potentially, but that doesn't mean there's not gonna be some diamonds in the rough. I have a feeling there's, certain visuals, I mean, I'm just looking at it and I'm like, "This is beautiful." So look, I wanna be positive about this series. We're only a few weeks out. There's been things that have given me a lot of reason to doubt it, but at the end of the day, I want to just I want to believe that, it's not gonna be the best thing ever, probably not, but maybe it won't perhaps be nearly as bad as some people are saying. And even then, even if all these things are true, that the diversity is unnecessary, that the timeline's condensed and it's weird, even if all those things are annoying, that they're placing characters in weird places, if the story is still really well told, all despite all of that, I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. Okay? That's all I'm saying. So, I'm looking at the finished product here and just kind of looking at it as, I know you're changing all these things, and I'm not initially happy with it, but prove to me that you can still make a good show even after you've done all this rearranging and, you know, eyebrow raising kind of adjustments to the lore. There still maybe is a chance of hope there, but we shall see. You'll see in my review what I think about it. And that's just how it's going to have to be. I don't know. We'll Amazon, Amazon, Amazon. Why? Why did it have to be Amazon? Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this very lengthy video essay I wanted to make on the show. I wanted to touch on so many points, that's why it's so long. Let me know in the comments all of your thoughts. Please don't hold back. I want to hear everything. This is a place to discuss all of our theories on all of our hopes and fears about this show because I'm just so passionate about Tolkien. Like I just had to get this all out there. I just had to. This is the media event. This is the big media event for me of the decade. Like this is huge. Like no other TV show I'm this excited for. Well, I'm this hyped for in that regard of like I care so much. Um, if that makes any sense. Thank you all so much for watching. Please give this a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you are new, and I'll see you all in my next one. Peace, love, and light. Bye.